The Background to the Civil War, Part 3. The presidential election of 1860 almost amounted to two separate races, one in the North and one in the South. In the North, everybody was voting for either Lincoln or Douglas. In the South, everybody was voting for either Breckinridge or Bell. And so it's one election, four candidates, but it's almost like it's two separate elections. Only two viable candidates in the North receiving votes, only two viable candidates in the South receiving votes. Now, what happened in the end is that Lincoln won only 40% of the popular vote. 60% of the American people voted against Lincoln, only 40% voted for him. But he won a majority in the Electoral College, and so he won the election fair and square. So how can that happen? Only 40% of the American people vote for a candidate, but he wins the election in the Electoral College. Well, let's look at the electoral map. You can see in the popular vote, Lincoln got 40%. But Lincoln's vote was concentrated in the North, and he pretty much swept the northern states. And if you win a state, it's winner take all in the Electoral College. And so Lincoln ends up with 59% of the electoral vote. He wins the election fair and square. Now in the South, you can see Breckinridge is winning the southern states. And so he's racking up electoral votes, ends up with 24% of the electoral votes. Look at Douglas, though. Douglas won 29% of the popular vote, nearly a third, but he wasn't winning states. He only won Missouri and South Jersey, and so Douglas ended up with only 4% of the electoral vote. Lincoln is an example of what we call a minority president, and we're not talking about a racial minority, we're talking about an electoral minority. Lincoln only won 40% of the popular vote, a minority vote, but he won the election fair and square in the Electoral College. This happens more often than we realize. It happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton got more popular votes, but Trump won in the Electoral College. It happened in 2000. Gore got more popular votes. G.W. Bush won in the Electoral College. It happened in 1992 when Bill Clinton won the presidency the first time. When Clinton won the presidency the first time in 1992, he only got 40% of the popular vote. Only 40% of the people voted for Clinton, 60% voted against him. In 1992, there was a third-party candidate named H. Ross Perot, who split up the votes three ways: Clinton, Bush Sr., Perot, and Clinton ended up with an electoral majority, even though he only had 40% of the popular vote. So anytime you have a third-party candidate, or as in 1860, a third and fourth-party candidate, you're liable to get a minority president. Now you'll notice that Lincoln got no votes in the South. The Republican Party didn't even exist in the South. It's a Northern party only. Anyone in the South who even tried to vote for Lincoln was taking his life in his hands. Consider this man. His name was Benjamin Hedrick. He was a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. In 1860, he announced publicly on campus that he intended to vote for Lincoln. Lincoln's name wasn't on the ballot, but he'd write it in. Well, word spread around town, around campus. A mob formed, and they ran the professor out of town. And then they demolished his house. That's what happened to people in the South who even tried to vote for Lincoln. It was not tolerated. In response to Abraham Lincoln's election, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union. To secede from the Union means to leave the United States to form their own nation called the Confederate States of America. Now, look at the Confederate States of America for a moment, and then compare it to the Breckinridge states in the election, and you'll see it's almost identical. Almost identical. Add Tennessee to the Breckinridge states, add Virginia to the Breckinridge states, and you have the Confederate States of America. And by the way, the word is secede. It is not succeed. The South seceded from the Union. It did not succeed from the Union. Please do not, on the final exam, please do not write the South succeeded from the Union. If you do, I might have to fail you. Okay? I get tired of reading the South succeeded from the Union. All right, let's think about why the South seceded from the Union. This isn't really the American way. It's really not the Democratic way. Usually when a guy gets elected president who we don't like, we put up with the bum for 4 years and just make sure we vote him out 4 years later. Why didn't the South do this in 1860? Why not just put up with Lincoln for 4 years and then vote him out in 1864? Why break up the country and leave the Union over his election? Well, think about it. This guy was elected president, and he wasn't even on the ballot in your state. Your whole region of the country already voted against him, and he still got elected president. If you're a white Southerner, what does that tell you? You can't vote Lincoln out. You are a hopeless minority within the nation. The North can elect a president without the South. That is terrifying to white Southerners, because that means in 1864 it's going to be Lincoln again. In 1868 it's going to be Lincoln again. It's going to be Lincoln as long as the North wants Lincoln. And as a Southerner, there's nothing you can do about it. Now, what is the one thing Lincoln has promised he's going to do? He's going to keep slavery out of the Western territories. Now we know Lincoln can do that, and he can do it indefinitely. If you're a white Southerner, you know what that means. You know that means slavery is doomed. It's just a matter of time, and slavery will die. And that is terrifying to white Southerners. They're not going to wait around for that to happen. They are gone today. And so they secede from the Union. Sometimes Southern secession is called a revolution, like the American Revolution. But secession is not a revolution, because the very definition of revolution is to achieve change. And the South is trying to prevent change, to prevent anything from happening to the institution of slavery. And so Southern secession is not a revolution. It's a counter-revolution. And it's a preemptive strike to prevent change. And so Southern secession is in fact a preemptive counter-revolution. Now, what about the North? Why did the North go to war? President Lincoln chose to go to war to preserve the Union, rather than to let the Southern states go, or to make concessions to the Southern states to keep them from seceding. Lincoln refused to compromise. Perhaps he could have prevented the Civil War if he had just compromised with the South and let slavery expand a little. But Lincoln would not budge. He would not compromise, because he thought democracy was at stake. The founders' experiment in Republican government was at stake. Put yourself in Lincoln's shoes. I want a free and fair election in a democracy. Now I have the right to take office and govern without any strings attached. But wait a minute. These Southerners who lost the election are now trying to place strings on my election and lay down conditions, or they're going to leave. But I can't let that happen. If I allow the majority to lay down conditions and put strings on my election, if I allow the minority, rather, to put strings on my election and lay down conditions, if I allow the minority to do that, then we are no longer a democracy. Instead, we have turned into an aristocracy, with the Southern slaveholders as the aristocrats calling the shots. I cannot allow that to happen. So President Lincoln decided to use force to uphold the will of the majority and the outcome of the election. Secession is the great test of popular self-government, of the survival of the American Republic, and the principles for which it stood. Can mankind govern himself by majority rule or not? If the minority can pack up and leave when they lose an election, then democracy has failed. Lincoln argued that since the United States was the world's only republic, the only freely elected government, the future of civilization rested on the war's outcome. There were global implications here. The U.S. is the Republican experiment. If it failed, then democracy fails, for all people, for all nations, for all time. This is the test case. Now, if there's a cause worth fighting for, and maybe even dying for, perhaps this is it. Lincoln stated this theme so many ways, so eloquently, but perhaps he stated it best at Gettysburg, in his famous Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln argued that the North needs to win the war to ensure, quote, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So, one final comment. Yes, absolutely, slavery caused the war. Why did the South secede? Because Lincoln was elected president. What was it about Lincoln the South didn't like? His position against slavery. Absolutely, slavery caused the war. But that does not mean that the North went to war to end slavery. The North did not go to war to end slavery. The North went to war to keep the country whole, to keep the South from seceding, to keep the Southern states from leaving. The North went to war to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. It's not going to be until 2 years into the war that the North will realize they're not getting anywhere and they cannot win the war without ending slavery. Then the war to preserve the Union will also become a war to end slavery. But that's not until 2 years later. And so the bottom line, yes, slavery caused the war, but the North did not go to war to end slavery. The North went to war to save the Union, to uphold the outcome of the election, and to keep the country together.